What happens when the will of a single medieval king becomes more dangerous than any enemy army surrounding his realm? Imagine a ruler whose desires carry the weight of law, whose impulses reshape the fate of nations, and whose vengeance leaves scars that echo through centuries. King Philip V of France, often portrayed as a calculating architect of royal authority, harbored whims that went far beyond political ambition. These were not mere decisions of governance. They were obsessions, sharpened by paranoia, fueled by the hunger to dominate every inch of medieval power. And the people who lived under his rule often had no idea how close they stood to the edge of his unpredictable wrath. To understand the brutality behind these royal whims, you have to step inside a court where silence was safer than loyalty, where suspicion replaced counsel, and where Philip IV pushed the boundaries of medieval cruelty in ways that even chroniclers struggled to record. His reign was not simply a struggle for supremacy. It was a stage where hidden atrocities unfolded behind marble walls and golden emblems. The king's decisions were whispered about in monasteries, feared in noble manners, and felt in the broken lives of those who dared to stand in his path. And yet the deeper you look into these historical episodes, the more you realize that the violence he unleashed served a purpose far darker than the preservation of royal order. Philip understood that terror was a language, and he wielded it with the precision of a blade. He manipulated fear with the same skill that other kings used to command armies. His whims were not random. They were carefully measured acts designed to crush resistance, reshape political alliances, and eliminate anyone who threatened the fragile structure of his authority. Once you start uncovering the decisions he took in secrecy, the punishments he imposed without hesitation, and the calculated cruelty behind each gesture, you begin to see a pattern that medieval chronicles often tried to soften, but the truth still lingers between the lines. As we explore these hidden acts of domination, it becomes impossible not to confront the unsettling question: how far can a king go before his power collapses under the weight of his own brutality? And more importantly, how many lives are shattered along the way? These episodes reveal a ruler willing to risk everything: reputation, stability, even spiritual legitimacy, in order to satisfy impulses that grew more dangerous with every victory he claimed. The deeper we go, the more you will see how each royal whim set in motion consequences that spiraled far beyond the king's intention, shaping the violent landscape of medieval Europe in ways that history rarely dares to illuminate. If you have ever felt curious about how a single decision can change the course of countless lives, or if you have wondered what truly lies beneath the polished image of medieval royalty, share your thoughts here. Your perspective helps deepen this exploration, so leave a comment with what struck you the most so far. Make sure to like the video and check that you are subscribed to the channel, because what you are about to discover may challenge everything you thought you knew about power. And as we move forward, the shadows behind Philip IV's most dangerous whims will only grow darker as each layer unfolds. The deeper you step into the world shaped by Philip IV, the more you feel the weight of a king who believed that authority should never be questioned, not even in whispers. It was during one of the most turbulent phases of his reign that a single ambition began to grow inside him: a desire to bend not only nobles and rivals, but also institutions that had stood for centuries. This was not a moment of desperation. It was a calculated transformation, a turning point when the monarch's will hardened into something far more dangerous. Those around him sensed the shift long before they understood what it meant. Servants lowered their voices in corridors, once filled with laughter. Advisors measured their words with the precision of men facing a blade. Even allies began to feel a quiet chill, recognizing that the king's vision for France had darkened, stretching beyond the boundaries of traditional rule into something entirely different. What ignited this transformation was not a single event, but a slow accumulation of frustrations, rivalries, and perceived betrayals. Each meeting that contradicted him, each noble who hesitated before obeying, each institution that dared to assert independence fed the fire burning in the king's mind. This was a ruler convinced that control was the only path to survival, and that any sign of disobedience, no matter how small, carried the potential to unravel everything he had built. So he sharpened his ambitions like a weapon, preparing to strike where it would hurt the most. He saw power not as a divine gift, but as something fragile, something that had to be defended with force, deception, and intimidation. As the pressure intensified, his court became a battlefield of invisible forces. Tension circulated like smoke, curling into every chamber, every decision, every quiet interaction. Philip understood how to exploit that tension, turning fear into a tool that made even the most powerful figures hesitate. His boldness grew as he realized that each dramatic gesture, each unexpected display of cruelty or authority, pushed the limits of medieval politics further than they had ever been pushed before. The king was no longer just asserting dominance, he was reshaping the very idea of royal power. And those who opposed him soon discovered that resistance came at a cost far greater than they imagined, a cost paid not only in influence, but sometimes in blood. Yet what makes this moment so critical is how quickly it escalated. Once Philip embraced this new form of rule, he no longer held back. The key, bold decisions he began to make reverberated across kingdoms, altering diplomatic relations, destabilizing alliances, and forcing even distant rulers to reconsider how far a monarch might go when driven not by necessity, but by personal will. Chronicles later recorded these events as if they were inevitable outcomes of political conflict, but the truth is far more unsettling. What unfolded was the result of a single man's shifting vision, a monarch who believed that absolute control justified any action, no matter how severe, no matter how irreversible. And as the consequences spread, they carried an unmistakable message to every corner of medieval Europe. When a king begins to see his own desires as the ultimate law, the world around him can be remade through fear alone, setting in motion a chain of events that cannot be undone. Once the king embraced this dangerous new rhythm of dominance, the consequences began to unfold with a precision that felt almost ritualistic. One decision in particular revealed how far he was willing to go, and how quickly alliances could crumble when his authority was challenged. At first, those close to the throne assumed it was a temporary dispute, a momentary clash between the crown and one of its traditional partners. But beneath the surface, something far more profound was shifting. Philip IV no longer saw loyalty as the bond holding his kingdom together. He saw it as a resource to be extracted, manipulated, and discarded at will. And the moment an ally hesitated or expressed even the slightest resistance, the king reacted as though betrayal were already in motion. This transformation became unmistakable when he targeted a group that had once been considered essential to France's political stability. For generations, they had been powerful, respected, and deeply intertwined with European authority. But to Philip, their influence had grown too large, their independence too dangerous, their wealth too tempting. What began as subtle pressure soon turned into open hostility. Letters delivered with courteous phrasing, concealed warnings sharp enough to draw blood. Negotiations became traps, each conversation twisting toward accusations no one could defend against. The king understood that appearances mattered. So he crafted a narrative in which those he sought to eliminate were portrayed as enemies of the realm itself. The effect was devastating. Allies who had once stood proudly beside the crown found themselves isolated in a maze of political tension. Their prestige eroded as rumors spread, carefully fed by the king's agents and amplified by the fear that already permeated the court. Medieval society relied heavily on reputation, and Philip weaponized that truth with chilling efficiency. Accusations were whispered first, then proclaimed openly. And as the kingdom watched them fall from favor, uncertainty rippled outward, reaching every noble household, every council chamber, every monastery that dared to speculate on the king's intentions. The moment Philip made his decisive move, there was no turning back. He launched a series of actions designed not merely to weaken his former allies, but to destroy them completely. Arrests carried out at dawn, interrogations designed to break even the proudest spirits, confessions extracted under methods so harsh that chroniclers hesitated to record them. What emerged was a spectacle of power, a demonstration that no legacy, no tradition, no institution was safe from the king's growing conviction that everything must bend to his will. What makes this episode truly revealing is the precision of his approach. He did not lash out blindly. He dismantled his opponents piece by piece, stripping away their authority, seizing their assets, and rewriting public perception so thoroughly that even those who once admired them began to doubt their innocence. This was not justice. It was a calculated performance of dominance, staged before the entire kingdom to send a clear message. Resistance was not merely futile, it was fatal. And yet, even as the king reveled in the success of his campaign, the seeds of future turmoil were already being planted, spreading silently through the political landscape he believed he had mastered. What followed after the king dismantled his former allies was not a moment of triumph, as many at court expected, but the unveiling of a new and far more unsettling pattern. Philip IV had discovered the effectiveness of cruelty hidden beneath the cloak of royal righteousness, and now he wielded that cruelty with a confidence that left even his closest supporters uneasy. It became clear that he no longer viewed violence as a last resort. It had become a strategy, a deliberate method for reshaping the political landscape of medieval France. The instruments of fear were sharpened, and the king deployed them with a precision that suggested both calculation and a growing appetite for domination. Those who had once stood proudly in his presence now did so with lowered eyes, aware that one misstep could place them among his next targets. The court transformed into a place where every gesture mattered. Ministers avoided expressing opinions too quickly, servants hesitated before relaying messages, and ambassadors from neighboring kingdoms found themselves studying the king's mood with the intensity of men searching for signs of a coming storm. Philip's reputation for cold efficiency had long been known, but now it was something else entirely. His decisions carried a weight that made the entire realm feel as though it were balancing on a knife's edge. Any disagreement, even one voiced politely, was interpreted as a threat. And threats were dealt with swiftly, without hesitation, and without the mercy traditionally expected from a Christian monarch. One of the most striking aspects of this new phase was how Philip wrapped his actions in the language of justice and divine duty. He declared that his harshest measures were taken for the good of the kingdom, for the stability of France, for the preservation of royal order. And yet, behind that rhetoric, the cruelty grew darker. Punishments became more public, as though the king wanted the entire population to witness the consequences of disobedience. Arrests happened without warning, carried out with a theatrical impact that instilled fear throughout the cities. Families of the accused were left to navigate a labyrinth of uncertainty, pleading for mercy from a king who had already decided their fate long before their voices could reach him. Still, what defined this moment was not only brutality, but the way it was orchestrated. Philip chose the timing of each action carefully, ensuring that every display of force shaped the narrative he wanted France to accept. He cultivated an aura of inevitability around his decisions, making resistance seem impossible, even foolish, and the more he succeeded, the more he believed that no boundary stood beyond his reach. Chronicles recorded the events with caution, aware that even historians risked becoming victims of their own words. Yet between the lines, the truth remained. The king had begun to enjoy the power he derived from fear. It is in these shadows of authority that one begins to see how cruelty became a weapon of governance, a tool used not simply to silence opposition, but to mold the kingdom into a reflection of the king's own desires. As you follow the unfolding of these events, take a moment to consider how this shift in royal behavior would have felt to the people living beneath it. Share your thoughts in the comments about how these actions shaped the era, or what stands out to you most as Philip's cruelty deepens, and let your interpretation become part of this unfolding exploration of power. As Philip IV tightened his grip on every corner of authority, another layer of hidden strategy began to surface, one that revealed how carefully he manipulated secrecy, deception, and misinformation to achieve his goals. In medieval courts, rumors traveled faster than messengers, and fear often carried more weight than official proclamations. The king understood this better than anyone. He allowed just enough information to slip through the cracks to keep the population uncertain, while carefully suppressing anything that might expose the full extent of his plans. The result was a kingdom trapped between what it knew, what it feared, and what it could not bear to imagine. People spoke cautiously in marketplaces, bishops whispered in chambers lit by flickering candles, and even nobles struggled to decide whether caution or loyalty would offer better protection. Behind the veil of royal authority, the king constructed networks of informants whose loyalty was purchased through promises, threats, or subtle coercion. These agents moved through taverns, monasteries, and noble courts, collecting fragments of conversations and weaving them into narratives that could be used against the king's enemies. It was a system of surveillance long before such practices were formally recognized, and it allowed Philip to strike with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to his contemporaries. By the time his targets realized they were under scrutiny, the accusations had already been crafted, the public perception already shaped. Resistance, no matter how rational, became futile once the king's version of events spread through every layer of society. What made this period especially disturbing was how Philip intertwined truth and falsehood so seamlessly that even his most experienced counselors struggled to separate fact from fabrication. Documents could be altered, testimonies manipulated, and confessions extracted through methods that left no room for doubt, at least not doubt that could be voiced safely. The king's opponents found themselves trapped inside accusations they could neither escape nor fully understand, as though they were fighting shadows cast by their own reputations. Medieval chroniclers later described these tactics with guarded words, careful not to accuse the king directly, yet unable to conceal the unease that surrounded his methods. In this atmosphere of controlled uncertainty, many of Philip's most brutal decisions appeared justified to the public. After all, if the king claimed to be defending France from threats, who could challenge him without risking the same fate as those he condemned? Every action he took was framed as necessary for order, stability, or divine purpose. But those who looked more deeply into the patterns understood that something far more calculated was happening behind closed doors. The king was not merely punishing crimes, he was eliminating obstacles, he was reshaping alliances, redistributing wealth, and weakening groups whose power might one day compete with his own. The more subtle his strategies became, the more dangerous they were, for they allowed him to strike from darkness while appearing to act in the light. This hidden machinery of control became one of the defining elements of his reign. It created a realm where no one could be sure of their standing, where every gesture was subject to interpretation, and where silence felt safer than truth. Yet beneath this oppressive calm, tension continued to build, setting the stage for consequences that even the king could not fully predict. And as the kingdom followed his lead, unaware of how deeply these manipulations would carve themselves into the fabric of French history, the path ahead grew increasingly unstable, shaped by forces that had already begun slipping beyond the king's control. As the kingdom adjusted to the ever-tightening grip of royal power, Philip IV began to refine his methods with a precision that bordered on ritual. What had started as strategic manipulation evolved into something darker, more structured, almost ceremonial in its execution. Each act of suppression unfolded with a disturbing consistency, as though the king were following an unwritten script designed to break not only the bodies of his enemies, but the collective spirit of the realm. It was during this phase that his punishments took on symbolic meaning, transforming political retribution into a theater of authority. Those who witnessed these events understood that they were not simply watching justice. They were watching a display meant to etch fear into the memory of the kingdom. The process followed a familiar pattern. First came the quiet summons, delivered with courteous phrasing that concealed the gravity of what was to follow. The accused, often unprepared, sometimes unaware of the precise charges, would be led into interrogation chambers where the boundaries between truth and survival grew impossibly thin. Confessions were not always demanded for their accuracy, but for their usefulness, crafted into narratives that aligned with the king's intentions. Each admission, whether coerced or invented under duress, served as another stone in the structure of authority Philip was building. And once the confession was secured, the ritual moved to its next stage. What distinguished this era was how public the punishments became. Executions, imprisonments, and humiliations were no longer quiet resolutions, but spectacles staged for maximum emotional impact. Crowds gathered in squares to watch the culmination of the king's judgments, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or something far more calculated. These events served a dual purpose. They eliminated threats while teaching the population a lesson that could not be forgotten. And though the people spoke about these scenes with horror, they also recognized the power behind them, a power that demanded obedience and reshaped the boundaries of medieval society. In the midst of this, those closest to the throne began to understand that the king's brutality had shifted from mere strategy to something deeply ingrained in his rule. Advisors who once debated policy with confidence now approached discussions with caution, measuring their words as though each syllable could determine their fate. The atmosphere in the court grew heavier, as if every chamber carried the echo of past accusations. Even the rituals of daily governance, audiences, councils, and negotiations were infused with a quiet dread, for no one could predict when a simple disagreement might escalate into a royal decree of punishment. What made this transformation particularly unsettling was how seamlessly Philip blended ritualistic violence with the language of order and stability. He positioned each punishment as necessary, unavoidable, even sacred in its purpose. By framing brutality as a means of preserving the kingdom, he reshaped the moral framework of his rule, convincing many that the suffering inflicted upon others was simply the price of maintaining peace. Yet beneath this facade of righteousness, tension deepened. As the king continued to impose his will with increasing severity, he failed to recognize that such rituals, once set in motion, often produce consequences beyond the control of those who design them. The stage he constructed so carefully was becoming unstable, and the actors he forced upon it carried stories that would not remain silent forever. As Philip IV continued to strengthen his authority through carefully orchestrated displays of dominance, he failed to perceive how deeply the consequences of his choices were beginning to ripple outward. The court, once a place of calculated ambition and political maneuvering, now resembled a landscape scarred by uncertainty. Every harsh decree, every public punishment, every whispered accusation forged an environment where fear spread faster than fire. This new reality did not merely intimidate his opponents, it reshaped the psyche of the kingdom itself. People began to understand that a single royal whim could alter the course of entire families, shatter alliances, and erase reputations built across generations. And beneath this growing anxiety, something else was shifting, something the king never intended. The more Philip asserted control, the more his decisions began to collide with forces he could not fully comprehend. Medieval power did not exist in isolation. It was a delicate web of loyalties, obligations, and unspoken agreements. By violating these structures so aggressively, the king unintentionally destabilized the very foundations he relied upon. Nobles who once pledged unwavering loyalty now questioned their safety, wondering whether proximity to the throne was a privilege or a trap. Clerics whispered about divine justice, troubled by the severity of punishments inflicted on those the church considered under its protection. Even foreign rulers, once wary of antagonizing the French crown, started observing Philip's actions with suspicion, interpreting his brutality as a sign of internal weakness rather than strength. Yet the most profound consequences emerged from the shadows where ordinary people lived. Merchants, craftsmen, and peasants, who rarely concerned themselves with the intrigues of royal power, began sharing stories of arrests, confiscations, and disappearances. Fear became a form of currency exchanged in hushed conversations at market stalls and around hearthfires. The king's heavy hand had reached into the daily lives of the population, and their unease formed a subtle but powerful undercurrent running through the kingdom. What Philip imagined as acts of control were slowly transforming into seeds of resentment, and resentment, once planted, tends to grow in directions no monarch can predict. Chronicles from the period, though cautious in tone, suggest that even some members of the royal household sensed the coming fracture. Advisors noticed how hardened the king had become, how unwilling he was to consider counsel that conflicted with his instincts. They whispered among themselves, speculating about the strain such relentless severity placed upon a kingdom accustomed to negotiated power. Meanwhile, those who had suffered from the king's decisions, families stripped of wealth, allies condemned without clarity, institutions targeted for their influence, carried with them memories that would eventually echo through generations. These were not minor grievances, they were wounds that shaped the political landscape long after Philip's reign ended. And so the king, who believed he could mold France through force alone, stood at the center of a storm he had inadvertently created. His harshest actions, meant to assert dominance, instead revealed the limits of his control. The kingdom was beginning to respond, though quietly at first, in ways that would soon challenge even the most absolute power. As we trace these consequences, consider which of them feels most striking or unexpected to you. Share your thoughts in the comments and let your perspective add another layer to this unfolding exploration of how a single ruler's decisions can spiral far beyond their intended reach. As the kingdom absorbed the shockwaves of the king's relentless decisions, a subtle transformation began to spread through the political landscape, one that Philip IV could neither anticipate nor control. His authority still appeared unshakable on the surface, strengthened by fear and ritualized violence, but beneath that exterior, the structures that had sustained his power were beginning to fracture. The people around him grew more cautious, more strategic, and more aware of the dangers hidden within the king's impulses. And though none dared speak openly, an invisible network of hesitation and quiet resistance started to take form. It was not organized, not deliberate at first. It emerged naturally whenever a ruler stretched the limits of obedience too far. Those who once aligned themselves closely with the crown began to re-evaluate their positions. Noble families whose fortunes depended on royal favor now questioned whether loyalty offered any real security. Bishops debated the theological implications of supporting a king whose methods contradicted the moral foundations of their authority. Even military leaders, men accustomed to discipline and hierarchy, recognized that instability at the top could turn into disaster on the battlefield. Each of these concerns remained unspoken, yet together they created a current of uncertainty that slowly eroded the king's influence. Philip, ever confident in the mechanisms of fear, mistook silence for submission, unaware that silence often hides the earliest signs of revolt. Beyond the court, the effects of his rule became increasingly visible. Trades suffered as merchants hesitated to navigate a realm where property could be seized at the king's command. Diplomacy grew strained as foreign rulers reconsidered alliances with a monarch whose unpredictability threatened regional balance. Local officials, once eager to enforce royal decrees, now hesitated, calculating the personal risk of carrying out orders that might place them on the wrong side of shifting political winds. In villages and towns, stories of confiscated wealth and imprisoned families traveled quickly, feeding a growing belief that the king's reach had become dangerously excessive. What made this moment particularly precarious was how unaware Philip seemed of the tension gathering around him. He believed the kingdom was stronger under his firm control, interpreting fear as evidence of stability. But the truth was far more complex. Power maintained solely through intimidation is brittle. It can shatter suddenly, often at the moment when the ruler believes it most secure. As Philip continued to pursue his agenda with unwavering intensity, he overlooked the subtle signs of a kingdom beginning to recoil from his grasp. The institutions he pressured and the alliances he strained were the very pillars that had long supported the French monarchy. By weakening them, he weakened himself. The most striking aspect of this shift was the growing sense that the king, for all his intelligence and calculation, had misjudged the limits of human endurance. A society can tolerate harsh rule, but not endlessly. Even those who benefited from Philip's authority sensed that the equilibrium of medieval power had been disturbed. And although rebellion was still a distant threat, the conditions that would make it possible were quietly taking shape. Every decision he made, every punishment he carried out, every silence he enforced contributed to a momentum that would not stop simply because he commanded it to. The system he thought he controlled was now responding in ways he could neither foresee nor restrain, setting the stage for consequences that extended far beyond his intentions. As the effects of Philip IV's decisions continued to spread, the kingdom entered a phase marked by an even deeper and more personal kind of suffering. It was no longer simply the nobles or institutions at risk. Entire communities now felt the weight of the king's relentless actions. Stories of persecution began to circulate through villages and towns with increasing urgency, shaping the way people understood both their ruler and the fragility of their own safety. What had once seemed like distant political maneuvering now appeared at their doorsteps, disrupting the rhythm of everyday life and leaving behind a trail of fear that lingered in the minds of families for generations. The king's enemies were no longer defined by status or allegiance. They were defined by his suspicion, and suspicion could take root anywhere. One of the most haunting elements of this period was the systematic nature of the king's hunt for those he deemed threats. His campaigns reached across borders, infiltrating networks that had existed long before his reign. Inquisition-like procedures emerged, targeting groups whose influence, wealth, or independence challenged the absolute control Philip sought to impose. Entire communities were interrogated, pressured to confess to crimes they did not understand, accused of conspiracies that had little grounding in reality but served the king's broader narrative. Medieval chroniclers, writing with caution long after the events, admitted that the severity of these operations left a mark unlike anything previously seen in the kingdom. The consequences extended beyond the immediate victims. Families associated with the accused found themselves ostracized, their social standing reduced, their property seized without warning. Children grew up bearing the shadow of their parents' alleged offenses, often forced into lives of poverty or exile. Merchants whose livelihoods depended on stable trade lost everything when fear swept through regional markets. Clerics who spoke out against the cruelty risked imprisonment or worse, leaving religious institutions divided between moral conviction and survival. The king's pursuit of control, once focused on strategic figures, now extracted a price from the very people who formed the backbone of the kingdom. Meanwhile, resentment grew in quiet corners of society, where few dared to speak openly. The memory of those who had suffered became a silent testament to the king's excesses. People who once admired his strength now questioned the justice of his rule. Even the most loyal subjects, those who benefited from royal favor, felt an unease they could not ignore. It was as though the foundation of trust between ruler and realm had cracked, leaving behind a network of fractures that widened with each new decree. And although Philip remained convinced that his actions were necessary to preserve order, he could not see how deeply he had damaged the very stability he sought to protect. What endured most powerfully from this era was not simply the violence itself, but the way it redefined the kingdom's collective memory. Generations later, stories of the persecutions continued to circulate, shaped and reshaped through oral tradition and written chronicles. These accounts preserved not only the events, but the emotions attached to them, the fear, the bitterness, the disbelief that a king could wield power with such devastating intensity. The legacy left behind was unlike any other, a reminder of how a single ruler's unrestrained decisions can ripple across centuries, influencing not just politics, but the very identity of a nation. And as the kingdom moved forward, the shadow of these persecutions lingered, silently influencing the path of history long after the king himself was gone. As the reign of Philip IV moved toward its final years, the consequences of his decisions no longer lived solely in the memories of those who witnessed them. They had woven themselves into the political fabric of the kingdom, becoming part of the silent architecture that shaped every negotiation, every alliance, every moment of tension. His harshest actions, once justified as necessary for order, had accumulated into a weight carried by the entire realm. Even those born long after the events could feel the echo of what had been done, as though the kingdom itself had absorbed the trauma of its king's most dangerous impulses. And while Philip believed he had secured a legacy of strength, the truth was far more complex. His reign demonstrated not only the reach of royal authority, but the staggering cost of pushing that authority beyond its natural limits. Across Europe, the consequences continued to unfold. Rulers studied his methods with a mixture of fascination and caution, recognizing both the power and the peril of his approach. Some admired his determination, his refusal to tolerate institutions that rivaled his influence. Others saw in his actions a warning of how quickly control can slip from a monarch's hands, once brutality becomes a tool rather than a last resort. His treatment of enemies, his calculated dismantling of established forces, and his readiness to weaponize fear created a reputation that endured long after his death. Even centuries later, historians found themselves wrestling with the dual nature of his rule. The administrative reforms that strengthened the French monarchy, and the violent excesses that scarred its memory. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Philip's legacy lies in how deeply it shaped the stories told about him. Medieval chroniclers softened their words, constrained by the need to protect themselves, yet hints of discomfort still seeped into their work. Later historians, free from those constraints, uncovered the darker threads woven beneath the surface. They found not just a king determined to consolidate power, but a ruler willing to destroy entire institutions to satisfy personal ambition. They found a man whose hunger for control pushed him into conflicts that reshaped the political map of Europe. And they found a legacy defined less by stability and more by the unsettling reminder that absolute authority can carry within it the seeds of its own unraveling. Yet even now, the full meaning of his actions is still being interpreted. Each generation re-examines the evidence, uncovering new layers of motive and consequence. His decisions continue to spark debate among scholars who try to understand how a single monarch could leave such a complex mark on history. And as we trace these events, moving through the shadows of his most dangerous whims, we begin to see how the violence of one ruler can outlast his lifetime, echoing through centuries in ways he never could have imagined. This lingering presence, this quiet influence, is part of what makes his story so compelling and so unsettling. It reminds us that history is not simply a record of what happened, but a living memory shaped by the actions of those who held power when the world was most fragile. If you stayed with me until this final moment, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me," so I know you reached the end and felt the weight of this story. If the depth of this narrative resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel so you can continue exploring the hidden layers of history with me, and give a like to help this work reach more people who value these forgotten truths. There is another video waiting here that expands on the themes we uncovered today, so click and continue this journey through the shadows of the past with me.